Welcome to Firefighting Today, the weekly video roundtable discussion show where we discuss all things fire service related. Firefighting Today is a production of PeteLamb.com. And now your host, Chief Peter Lamb.
Hello and welcome to Firefighting Today. This evening we're talking about what is your most challenging non-fire response. So that's what we're talking about this evening. And as we say each and every week, if you are watching us live on YouTube, please feel free to join us in the live chat. If you jump over there and leave a comment, we will suck you into the discussion here and make sure you get involved. And also, if you are watching us live on, let's say, the website, you certainly can leave a Twitter comment at Pete Lamb, and we are also monitoring that. So tonight's an interesting one. We're going to have to rely on our chat room tonight. Let me introduce the entirety of the panel. We'll see there's me, and then there's Chief Whitley.
Hi, guys. Warren Whitley, retired from Prince William County, Virginia. Pete and I will tackle this quickly or stretch it as long as y'all want. Just not past 9.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. So we've got a couple of viewers in the chat room already. So certainly if you're there, we're here for your discussion. I think what we talk about, obviously I believe that firefighting is, fighting fire, hoses, ladders, making rescues, search and rescue, SCBA, and all of that stuff. Sometimes referred to as the basics. And I think that that's important. I do think that as the fire service changes, I think we're getting stretched in different directions. And I think that one of the things you need to take a look at is what would be a situation. Now, of course, no fire department ever wants to say, well, we couldn't handle this, or this would be a challenge. Well, that's not what we're talking about here tonight. Tonight is not the time for bravado. Tonight is, have you even thought about, we threw some of the things in the show description tonight. Have you even thought about some of those things, and have you done a hazard analysis? I guess what I would say, Chief Whitley, why don't we talk about, like, how do I figure out, how do I know what I don't know? How do I look at what my most challenging situation might be? How would I go about that?
Well, one of the things, and you just mentioned, is the risk assessment is going out in your entire area of responsibility and seeing what's out there. What industry do you have? Everybody has storm drain networks, so you're already talking confined space for those types of issues. And they may not be a complicated confined space, but if you do a storm drain properly, you got to go through all the steps. So what do you have with industry? Do you have high angle stuff? Like a power plant where you might have catwalks and people up working high above the ground. Do you have, hazmat's an obvious one for the big stuff. What processes do you have in your area? Transportation. You could spend, and you should spend, a lot of time figuring out what is in your overall first due area, whether it's the county, city, or whatever your jurisdiction is, and seeing what those risks are and how do your equipment, training, and manpower stand up against it.
Yeah, well said. I think that certainly speaks to it, and that is, your assessment should, and we talked about trench rescue, confined space, high angle, some of the what I would say tech rescue stuff, and the point that I wanted to mention was, even if you are not ready to do that, most states, state academies, regional academies will have 3 levels of training for that, and that is generally awareness. What do you do to set up and get ready for a team that may be coming? Operations, maybe you can do some limited operations if you have the right training and equipment. And then actually technician level or tech rescue, if you will. So generally in the high angle and all of the tech rescue subjects, you have different levels. So if you recognize, after you do your risk assessment, you look around your area and you recognize that you do have some risks, make sure you're at least getting the awareness level training to figure out what you're supposed to be doing. So a couple of comments already. So Ethan, welcome. Thank you for being there. How much time should a department spend on the specialty stuff versus the basic fireground skills? Spend training time on. Well, I'll throw that to you, Warren, first, and then I'll dive in after. But so the question is, how much time should a department spend on the specialty stuff? And I think Warren and I will give you the same answer. It depends. But Warren, how would you answer that?
Yeah, it depends. When I used to teach technical rescue stuff, and it's highly perishable, I would not feel comfortable at all doing much with it these days. But we always talked about the training paradox. It takes an awful lot of training to learn skills you may execute only once in your career. So you have to really, Ethan, you need to budget where that time comes from, as opposed to doing your basic firefighting skills, and really should come after you're really good at all that stuff. When your department has firefighters that are really competent firefighters, then you can start to look at some of these specialty areas and see, one, what you can support time-wise, but also equipment-wise, because it's expensive. You might need specialized rigs to carry it on, more expense. And then do they need to be trained off duty, so on overtime type of deal, another expense. So it's a large management decision to figure out what you can support. And again, I would base that on what's your risk assessment for your community and what other resources are in the surrounding area that you can leverage to take care of the problem.
Yeah, I agree. And, we've said risk assessment a couple of times tonight. To answer this question, Ethan, I think we also do a run assessment. What runs are you how often are you going to have this versus, you look at your department's runs for a 2 or 3 year period, and that'll kind of tell you what your training plan might want to be for your organization. Maybe you got 2-lane roads. Maybe you're doing wrecks every other week. Maybe you're, what are most of your calls? Are you doing building fires every day? The building fire, when we say hazmat and we say building fire, I'm sure people are going to cringe. People will throw up when I say this. You're entering an IDLH environment with breathing apparatus. So if you're not doing that in your department more than 3 or 4 times a year, that's a pretty high risk event for you. And you might have a high angle technical rescue once every 3 years. So even if you did spend training time, if you made that training time investment, regardless of cost, dollars and cents cost, as I think the other key point that Chief Whitley just said is, what's the deterioration of skills? What did they tell us years ago? I guess if you don't do CPR in 3 months, you don't remember. You know what I mean? There's a window of time at which skills, practical hands-on skills that you don't use, there is a window of time where that skill fades. So when you start talking about, was this the right carabiner to tie off with? That's not a discussion you want to have on the roof. So it's skill deterioration and figuring out, A, do I have this risk in my response district? But B, how many of these responses will I have? We cannot prepare for every emergency that we have. I mean, I've been studying this stuff for a long time and looking at it. And what was it last week? We had a woman partially sucked out of an airplane window. Do we have classes on that now? Because that's something that's not a common occurrence. It's something that's way outside the boundaries of, we know it's possible, but I don't recall ever hearing about that. So we cannot train for every eventuality. Although I would tell you, in today's society, I think the public expects that, quite frankly. I think they expect us to solve every problem. Chief Whitley.
I think you're right. But one other thing we can do, if you can't afford the time or the training or any of the investment is prevention. Back when I was a captain on an engine company, we had a lot of construction in the whole county, really. But if we'd go by a site where they had a trench in place and they were no obvious safety measures like a trench box or shoring and sheeting, we'd stop and I'd ask the foreman and say, I want the next of kin information for everybody down in that trench. And he'd look at me, what are you talking about? I says, well, right now we are not equipped to handle that incident. So I want to know, for recovery purposes, who's down there so we can notify their families because you're not following OSHA standards. And that would usually start to see compliance by the next day.
Yeah, certainly. Anytime you talk about, the person's liability or something, try to diffuse it or get it. The other thing that Chief Whitley and I were talking about offline, when you talk about some of these specialty things, the whole process slows down. If you're a small fire department in Middle America or our friends up in Canada, or maybe you got a small hall, 1 or 2 stations, 2 halls, you're used to, pulling out the truck, going lights and siren, responding to the scene, and you're back in business in 2 hours. When you start talking about these, your response time for a specialized team could be in excess of an hour or 2, and setup time to do it right and do it safely and correctly slows this process right down. So in terms of training, even training your personnel to just be aware of that, that's going to be a culture shift for your personnel, regardless of the technical skills that might be involved. Chief Whitley?
Yeah, I think another thing is you talked about the different levels, awareness, ops, and technician level. And I think the awareness level in those cases is the most critical. So we don't want the responders getting into the same trouble that the victims are that they're looking at. So we all have heard the story, seen the videos about usually it's a confined space rescue where the rescuers just jump in the hole because they can see the victim. They are overcome by whatever's down there. And now we've multiplied the problem. Where their real task should be, without the training or equipment, is just to deny access to the area and keep anybody else from becoming an additional victim. And that's hard. That's a hard mindset for a first responder to get into, is using your noggin and not your heart to make those decisions.
Yeah, that certainly is not the place where you need an emotional incident commander. Chief Woolery's with us, and Chief Woolery tosses out hazmat. I mean, hazmat is probably, in the early 80s and mid 80s, that slowed us down considerably. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, it made us think, made us operate differently. And you could probably, well, I don't have any industry in my response district, Chief. I don't have any of this. I don't have any of that. Do you have any trucks that drive down the road? Do you have trucks that, hazmat gets delivered to you? And I think one of the other things, I was talking involved in hazmat early on in the early days when it was still a sin. But the fact is today, I think hazmat is a little different today when we start talking about the biologicals and all of those. Hazmat is hazmat is hazmat. I get it. But one of the things that nobody ever taught me, and I certainly didn't teach others until it happened to me, we all talk about zones, hot, warm, and cold, and I'm setting myself up for a different topic here in a minute. But when we talk about hot, warm, and cold zones, nobody ever told me that the hot zone was going to come running at me. Contaminated patients will seek, they don't play by the little traffic cones and the little yellow tape and go through the decon area. If somebody thinks that they have something on their flesh that's contaminating them, or in fact maybe giving them burning sensations, they're coming after you. And so the hot zone might move, in fact. And I have a similar example when we change gears here in just a second. So thank you for that, Chief Woolery, about that. So the tech rescue stuff is all out there. What if your fire department does not do medical responses? And now you're getting involved in pseudo medical responses. Maybe the ambulance is run differently. Maybe you run a pumper out there or what have you. That gets involved. What about being contaminated with something like the drug fentanyl? What about skin absorption? What about all of this stuff? Even though you may not be an EMS provider per se, have you thought about that? What is the, when you're doing your risk analysis, what's the factory and who's got the chemical and how high is the highest and how low is the lowest? And maybe I got swiftwater rescue in these culverts and drainage ditches. We're not even thinking about the drug problem being a contamination problem for firefighters. Warren?
Yeah, I think that's I guess the latest dilemma is how do you combat that issue, knowing that first responders are running these patients and they may not have the protocols in place yet to try to avoid that exposure risk. And it's invisible. As far as I know, you can't see it. And a lot of times they can't tell you that's what they were playing with. So it's catching us by surprise. So now we have to go back, regroup, and look at what is our protective ensemble for these basic, what we thought were run-of-the-mill medical calls is changing. So that involves more training, more equipment, more time, because now you should really be accessing these patients a little more carefully, especially in areas where this stuff is prevalent. And so it's another conundrum for us to solve. And, they may be flopping on the ground, but you're going to have to think twice before you just run up to them.
Yeah, I think, years ago, the white powder was anthrax. When we saw white powder and that sort of stuff, that was an anthrax issue. And today it might be something entirely different. Chief Woolery, Lane's talking about, when we talking about hazmat was the West Texas, right? So, a small community has an incident of pretty substantial magnitude with hazardous materials. So I think the other one is this first responder stuff. You go to a car accident and somebody's got this stuff all over them or whatever, that is what caused them to drive off the road. And you're treating a trauma code, and in fact, it might be a drug overdose, and that's why they drove off the road in the first place. So it's a changing world. That might be a challenging, our title was a challenging run that is non-fire. I think the other one we got to put out on the table, and I'm in the midst of obtaining training and trying to get our personnel in the right position. And I think that's the whole active shooter. I think that is something that fire departments are going to respond to, whether you're an EMS provider or not. I think engine companies are going to be called for, stretcher bearers, litter bearers, carrying people. I think they've got to be involved in staging and so on and so forth. And I think that's a run. We say schools, we say whatever. I guess today was a Waffle House. So I don't think we know where that appears. That's a very, that could hit anywhere. We've seen it in churches. We've seen it in schools. We've seen it in outdoor concerts. The venue or the mode can be very different. And this is not a political statement or whatever. It's just something that firefighters have to respond to that I think takes a special skill set. And in the training that I'm getting right now, they actually are speaking in the same terms of hazmat, which is why I led with that a minute ago. The hot zone is the active shooter. The warm zone is still not a secure area, and the cold zone is staging. So I think that in this particular case, your department might have some training that can be transferable, that can come over. I think it's similar in some ways. So, Chief Whitley, your thoughts on that?
Well, for the active shooter, we can use the hazmat model pretty well: time, distance, and shielding. So, but a lot of that's got to be worked out. You need to have the plan that's worked out with you and your local law enforcement what role do they want you to play, and how can they protect you when you have to go in and treat or rescue people? Because we're not equipped to go in and face down an active shooter. So we need to, again, like you said, cold, warm, hot zone. We need to be in the cold zone awaiting whatever the plan is from the unified command post, and let the LE's got to have the lead on that. Otherwise, we're just going to become more victims.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very touchy situation. I think we all agree on the unified command, and the communication has to be pretty good on that. And I'm seeing we see people being trained as SWAT paramedics. We see fire departments that are wearing vests and helmets and going in. Our law enforcement has taken a different tack on that. So I think that I say that to say I'm not even sure there's a standard out there yet. I think there are some standards. I think there's a lot of commonality. But Chief Whitley aptly points out, you've got to talk about your own law enforcement, your county sheriff, your local police department, your state police agency, whoever that is, has got to give you your guidance. And, Warren uses the old nuclear, time distance shielding. I actually have a lot of friends that treat me that way. They think less time spent, more distance. I don't know. I'm beginning to get a complex about that. But time distance shielding works for a lot. That's another transferable phrase that works in a lot of different places. And I think it translates immediately over to the active shooter or the hazmat. Somebody said, what is your most challenging run that is a non-fire run? And this is kind of relative. Chuck in the chat room is talking about, a PTSD incident, not a PTSD, a critical incident stress, CISD incident. And that is CPR runs on children. Are you prepared for that? Have you trained for that? Yeah, we had this little rubber baby mannequin and we did CPR. That is much different than a parent who is right off the edge because their child is not breathing or whatever. So when you talk about a most challenging run, I thank you, Chuck, for bringing that up. I mean, the challenge could be, I don't have the right stuff in the confined space tripod and blah, blah, blah. But in fact, CPR on children and all of those things can be pretty devastating, and they can challenge you in another way. So thank you for that, Chuck. So Ethan brings up, again, what about the incident in West Webster, New York, where it wasn't the active shooter? Firefighters were actually the target. Somebody set the house on fire and waited and shot firefighters as they were arriving. So, we're the target. It's like the abortion clinic bombings where the second device went off to hurt responders. So, we think of ourselves as the good guys, if you will. Law enforcement, I have to tell you, I've made more cop fireman jokes in 40 years than anyone I know, but I have to tell you something. Law enforcement is under attack like something I've never seen in my lifetime. And my thoughts are out there. We just had an officer killed here in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. A 32-year-old officer was serving a search warrant and was shot, by someone who had only been arrested 125 times. So, they are under attack. And I think that brings a stress level, sort of like what Chuck, if one of our offices went down in a local community, we're going to want to go. We're going to put ourselves in harm's way, much like we do for rapid intervention and those kinds of things. So, strong, well-disciplined incident command is probably going to stop additional victims, as we said. So anything else, Warren? What are the other ones that we may not be thinking about?
So you kind of mentioned swift order rescue. That's another one of those training paradoxes. They don't happen often, but you still need the skills. So it is a time investment with equipment and training, and it's high risk. that's the common denominator here. They're low frequency, high risk. Off the top of my head, I think, we've covered hazmat and technical rescue, swift water, active shooters. Meteor impact. I can't think of anything else.
Yeah. Yeah, there was you have to be of a certain age to know this, but there was this fancy thing that was going to fall out of the sky years ago called Skylab. Skylab was going to fall out of the sky and hit us all or something like that. Lane's talking about his policy is, and I threw out some of these, but Lane's policy is they're going to use what's called force protection. It's sort of a military term where they will be protected by officers, and their paramedics or EMTs will go in active shooter situations, being protected by law enforcement personnel. So that is one of the models that I've looked at is force protection or staying, straight out in the cold zone or whatever. So lots of variables. It's really geographically dependent. And I think department size and resource, listen, everything we've talked about in the past few minutes here, department size and resources are the whole crux of this. If you're a volunteer department and your turnout during the day is 4 people, there's not a lot of stuff going on there. There's not a lot that can be achieved. So it like everything else we talk about, it becomes a resource game. But I think that in some of these, I just wanted to spend a minute because what I just mentioned by accident and what Chief Whitley was saying, I think one of the things we need to talk about in these high risk, low frequency, high risk events is personal discipline. This is personal discipline. The more dangerous the incident, the more the incident commander has to have a tight rein on what's going on. Well, the chief doesn't let us do, and the chief, you know what? The more risky this is, the tighter we got to run command, and the more we need discipline. You have to be disciplined yourself. Understand what the mission is. I think the active shooter and these other things that are going on, it's the other piece is MCI training. How much have we done with mass casualty training or mass casualty incidents, right? So there's really multiple casualty incidents and mass casualty incidents, all defined by your local geographic response system. You can figure it out. But even if you were not first responders or what have you, having triage training or the START system or whatever you use in your county or your response area, that would be a good skill that you could learn to figure out who goes first and who goes second. Even first responders can get involved in that, I think. Chief Whitley.
Yeah, that's something that takes practice. You have to practice the triage. Hopefully your area has a plan on the mass casualty, because then we get into the whole logistics issue with treatment and transport. And, how do you move large groups of people, even the uninjured? What are you going to do with them? You shelter them, whether it's a bad weather event, you got to have some place to shelter them, whether it's out of the hot sun or out of the rain and wind or snow or whatever. So, I guess the common denominator for a lot of this stuff we're talking about is you got to have a plan. So as you think about this stuff, it's figuring out what resources are available, especially mutual aid, automatic aid, whatever you have. Offline, we had talked about a regional approach where you could divvy up responsibilities to ease the burden of equipment and training. Your department could take care of high angle, your neighboring department could focus on confined space, things like that. And then you have to have combined training situations where how you can go support them, what equipment they're using, they know what to do to support you for your specialty. So there's ways to divvy that up, but I think planning is the big thing, identifying the resources you need ahead of time, because, when the event happens and you haven't done any of that, you're just flying by the seat of your pants, and it's probably not going to turn out as well as it could have.
Yeah, absolutely. Being on the front end of this, the plan is the issue. Chuck's talking about actually, he had unified command training yesterday with 20 departments and about 100 firefighters in the PD in Madison Heights. And Chuck, if you don't mind, where is Madison Heights? Where is that exactly? I don't need the street corner, but what part of the country are you in there? And Lane talks about the truck companies are expected to provide rope rescue and vehicle extrication, but he also recognizes one of the things that I like about you, Warren. You were in a large organization. I think Lane gets it as well. In a small department, your training hours could be eaten up just getting basic firefighter 1 and 2 stuff done. And EMT research, if you were a basic EMT. Ethan referenced early on, how much training hours do I commit to this specialized stuff? And the fact is, if you're training once a week, 4 times a month, a couple of hours, what are you getting? Maybe 6 to 8 hours of training a month in a volunteer system. You're not going to get a lot of specialized stuff done. So I think the other thing that I think is interesting, and this is going to sound a little crazy, but hear me out. It's like the first crazy thing I've ever said on the air. Look at the media. Look at the media. What did you see on the 6 o'clock news tonight? And then could that happen in your community? I mean, it really is that simple. Your research project might be coming to you in the morning paper or on the news or something of that nature. So, think about that. That might be an easy way to figure out what sort of stuff you need to be ready for. I think that might be a possibility for you to get some information. So, chat room, where else do you want to go? Because we've kind of tossed it around. We've been at it for about a half hour. We can have an abbreviated session tonight, but I'm certainly here, and Chief Whitley is certainly here. If you've got other issues that we have not thought about, or if you want to play Stump the Chiefs, now's your time to put it in the chat room and see what you can throw at us. But I think that the other thing that I said non-fire. Let's just we could certainly jump this one other. I think one of the issues that is a fire related issue, and there is a ton of training on rapid intervention and saving yourself and all of that. One of the challenging situations, and it is fire related, so I'm going off topic here, is if you're a command officer, what are you going to do when you hear the words Mayday? Mayday for a commander is training that I don't think we do enough of. I don't think, I think it's got to be simulation based, and I don't mean looking at a graphic on the board. I think you have to be under some pressure. I think you have to use radios. I think there has to be some sensory activity to make this realistic and make this happen. So I don't think I've mastered it. As I said in podcasts and what have you, I had 2 ugly situations. One of them was a firefighter down for a medical emergency inside during a fire attack. And the second one was we lost track of a crew for about 10 to 12 minutes. It might as well have been a month as far as I was concerned. But so that certainly doesn't make me an expert in any way, shape, or form. But as a challenging situation that you may not be ready for, the troops are ready to do rapid intervention, but are the commanders ready to manage that Mayday call? Chief Whitley.
I think you hit the nail on the head. It's one that has to be practiced and under as realistic conditions as you can make it, whether you have 2 or 3 officers yelling at you in your buggy while you're trying to manage this or whatever. But you have to practice your procedures, because some departments will stay on the channel it originated on and move everybody else to a different frequency, which makes more sense to me than the other one where they want the Mayday to switch to another channel. And now you're relying on the poor guys in trouble to switch their radios. So I would opt or advocate for the former, where the incident commander takes care of the Mayday and passes off the original incident to somebody else on another frequency, so he can concentrate on the Mayday itself. And
Yeah.
there's different trains of thought about that, who takes charge of the Mayday. Some people advocate the original incident commander stays with the original incident. So I guess it depends on what you practice and what resources do you have. Do you have another command officer on the scene already? Then you could hash it out then. But it's important, whatever your procedures are, everybody is on the same page and has practiced what they are.
Yeah, I agree. And as we said, in terms of the active shooter or what have you, there are as many schools of thought on this of who should do what and who should pass off what and how it works. Lane is saying that he agrees that we do a good job of training crews for the Mayday, but chiefs don't do it. And he also aptly points out that we should put get the dispatches in this plan as well. Get your communications division, whether they work directly for you or it's an outside agency or whatever it is. Communications Bureau has to be involved in that as well. So let's give it I'll turn the lights on and off in the chat room. If anybody's, last call in the chat room. If anybody's got anything else, we thank you for joining us on the abbreviated version, if you will, of the Firefighting Roundtable, and we will be back here next week. And I'm going to start offering cash money to be a panelist and stuff. See if I can reach. No, we just had some scheduling conflicts tonight.
Tonight's just the small table in the corner of the restaurant.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So we appreciate that. We appreciate you spending some time with us, and we will be back here next Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, and we'll see if we can stir up some more panel members. So I appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.